video, and if you don't need it, you can hit the pause button to stop that. We also ask that you please take the evaluation at the end of this session, which is available in your window via the feedback button, and you can ask questions as we go. We'll take them at the end of the presentation by using the Q&A feature, and please feel free to chat amongst each other and interact using the chat feature as well. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Doug Michael, MPHA board member and associate vice president at Northern Light, who will introduce our keynote presenter for today.
Welcome and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the opening session of Maine Public Health Association's 37th annual meeting, Dirigo, Rebuilding and Moving Forward Together. My name is Doug Michael, and I serve as a member of the MPHA Board of Directors and as the Chief Community Health Officer with Northern Light Health, one of several proud sponsors of this annual meeting. Rebuilding and moving forward together is the incredibly important and hard work in front of us all. At this moment in time, the COVID pandemic and the climate crisis are exposing several uncomfortable truths about the underlying inequalities and injustice which we harbor in our collective body. How will we choose to respond? How will we rebuild and move forward together in ways that improve health outcomes for all people? Please consider these questions as you participate in this morning's plenary and in the sessions that follow ahead. I'm honored this morning to introduce Penobscot Nation Tribal Ambassador Maulian Dana. In this role, Ambassador Dana presents issues important to both the Penobscot Nation and to ever wider Native and non-Native audiences, including land use, water rights, tribal sovereignty, to violence against Native American women, the eradication of the use of Native American mascots, and establishing Indigenous Peoples Day, the holiday we celebrated yesterday to honor Indigenous communities' presence thousands of years before European contact. In addition to her role as Penobscot Tribal Ambassador, she serves on the board of the Maine Center for Economic Policy, as co-chair of the Maine Climate Council's Equity Subcommittee, and as co-chair of the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Maine Tribal Populations. Ambassador Dana earned her undergraduate degree in political science from the University of Maine, Orono, where she received the prestigious Margaret Chase Smith Public Affairs Scholarship. In 2007, she published a book of poetry, Through These Eyes, Poetry of a Penobscot Woman. Thank you for your generous gift of time today and experience, Ambassador Dana.
Thank you so much, Doug, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone for having me today and inviting me today. Bulis Bazaway, Ndiliwizi Maulian Dana, Naganujayal Banawapske. Good morning. My name is Maulian Dana, and I am from the Penobscot Nation. I think it is well known by everyone that I do not work in public health or in any kind of health field. So when I got this very generous invitation to share today, I saw it as an opportunity to bring some of my perspectives and life experience as a Penobscot woman in Maine to, a very important population of caregivers and health workers and very important essential people in our state that really should know a lot of the history and baggage, for lack of a better word, of Indigenous people and how we can heal from all of that together. So I titled this talk, Health, Wellness, History, and Healing. And I'll warn you that it's going to start a little dark, that I thought about, the totality of the Indigenous experience and what that truly means. We have to go back to some very dark chapters in our individual and shared histories. But I promise you, I will speak about ways we can move forward together. And I believe that that's the goal of this whole session, right? Rebuilding and moving forward together. So when I read that, it really struck me because it was kind of a theme of, how I was envisioning this talk anyway. So I'm going to go down to the bottom first and highlight the Wabanaki nations in our ancestral territory now called Maine. My tribe is the Penobscot. We are essentially located in the state. The Passamaquoddy tribe is the largest of the tribal nations, and they are over in Washington County. They have 2 separate reservation communities. Up in Aroostook County, there is the Holton Band of Maliseets and the Aroostook Band of Micmac. And then there's also Abenaki people whose this is their ancestral homeland. They were displaced and greatly diminished during colonization and the unfortunate events that followed. But we do have Abenaki as part of our Wabanaki Confederacy. I always I always pray to the ancestors of the lost tribes, I call them. And these are upwards of 20 distinct tribal nations that once lived in this land and now are exterminated and it's extinct. When we think about the locations that I just described, I described where our reservation communities are, but I also like to keep in mind that this entire region, now called Maine, is our ancestral territory. We had very sophisticated hunting routes and, journeys we would take to the coast and back inland. And, we see ourselves as stewards of this whole land, and we truly care about the whole of Mother Earth, not just where our tribal lands are. Thinking about tribal nations and Indigenous people in America and Canada and this COVID-19 pandemic, it has been and still is extremely triggering for tribal nations. Disease was one of the first weapons utilized against our people. The settlers that arrived here brought with them diseases like smallpox that Indigenous people did not have immunity to. And this really, really diminished our populations. So that, germ warfare, and it really isn't clear whether the settlers and colonists knew that these diseases were killing Indigenous people, but it is documented that there was a belief that because all the tribal people were dying and getting afflicted with these horrible diseases, that was some kind of godly intervention. So this is where we get this concept of manifest destiny and doctrine of discovery, that somehow there was this divine right of settlers to exterminate all of the Indigenous people and seize up the land as their own. So I'll get into it a little bit more on the next slide, but there was also part of this continuation of the warfare to take over this land were these bounties that the Crown in England and later the governments here in Massachusetts and other colonies would put on the heads of Indigenous people. And I actually have a copy of one in the next slide, so we'll get into it a little bit more. So the theft of land and resources was very widespread and very devastating. And we think of this attempted genocide as kind of, I think, those two things, the disease, the war, and that encompasses kind of this big taking of land. But later, there was this, real push to assimilate Indigenous people. So the government had established itself, we had dealt with the Civil War and we're running the government. We've adopted the Constitution and all of this. And the Indigenous people were still kicking around. We were still here. And we had been pushed into reservations and really, dealt a heavy blow, but we were still here and had a lot of our identity intact. So there was this movement to, assimilate us in hopes that we could become more civilized, more part of mainstream society and leave behind our culture. And I think there was this fear that if we remained, we would rise up and rebel and try to take back what was taken. So we have this next horrible phase of our history where our children were taken from their families and put into boarding schools run by the federal government and the churches. And these boarding schools were actually more like concentration camps. The children were taken sometimes as young as 3 years old and brought miles and miles away from their families. And their hair was cut. They were abused for speaking their languages. They were just very much, it was forced indoctrination of Catholicism and everything that wasn't their culture. So over the past year, some of you may have seen that they are finding mass graves at these schools of children that had died there at the hands of the priests and the nuns and the administrators, and obviously never returned to their families. So as a mother myself, I think about, probably the worst thing I can imagine is being separated from my children, not being able to protect them. And this happened in every Indigenous family I can think of. We all have somebody in our families that either went away to school and returned very traumatized, or went away and didn't come back. So this is not ancient history. And this is how this intergenerational trauma really echoes through the generations. So what does moving forward together look like? And I want to focus I'll get through the next two slides that speak to a couple of the points I've already made, but I really want to focus on how we heal together. Oops, wrong way. So this is one of the bounty proclamations that I spoke about, and this was specific to Penobscot people, to my tribe. And this was in 1755, and it was the Penobscots had negotiated treaties with the government of Massachusetts that they would kind of help them and guide them on lands in what's now called Maine. But the Penobscots started to rebel and, not get along with them. And they were seen, and Penobscots were seen as kind of rising up and being dangerous. So this was a bounty specific to Penobscots. These bounties exist for many, many tribes. And what this says is basically the Penobscot Indians have acted against our government, against, England and Massachusetts, and there's a bounty on the scalps. So this also sets prices for the scalps of Penobscot men, women, and children. And so the Penobscot man, for his scalp, you would get 50 pounds if you brought them into a trading post where they would also trade furs of animals. And at the time, 50 pounds in our money would be like $11,000. So you have settlers that are starving through these long winters. And this, dehumanization of Penobscot people and other tribal people in Wabanaki territory, it really, this happened quite a bit. Normal people did very evil things because they were desperate and because it was validated by the government and these institutions. So this is how genocide happens. Now, I like this graphic. This speaks to the residential and the boarding schools that I spoke about. And I think it speaks a lot about the new hope that we're looking to find. So, there's been this orange shirt day that takes place on September 30th, and that's a Canadian thing that we've kind of adopted down here. And Canada conducted a countrywide Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we've done a similar thing here in Maine, dealing with foster homes. There's a lot of the same practices about assimilation and abuse in the foster care system right in Maine, and you can refer to the documentary Dawnland is an excellent study of that. And I really like this graphic because, there was horror that happened and some real trauma, but we're so lucky and so thankful that we exist still and that we were able to bring some of those kids home, as hard as it was. And now it feels hopeful that kind of the rest of the world is seeing this and observing our truth and bearing witness to our pain. It feels like only when we know this history together and we can be real and truthful and honest about it, can we walk forward together. And that's what I feel this really depicts. So there's the political, the personal, and how that fits into our health and tribal sovereignty. So thinking about tribal sovereignty in Maine, a recent effort that we're doing is trying to amend the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act. And this topic alone could probably last a good 3 hours, so I'll be as succinct as possible. In the late 1970s, it was discovered by first the Passamaquoddy tribe and later the Penobscot and Maliseet joined in. It was discovered that roughly 2/3 of the state of Maine had been illegally taken from the tribes because the treaties were not ratified by the federal government. So these claims were valid as found in court, and there was a suit brought against the state of Maine by the tribes and the federal government to try to settle these land claims. And what resulted did settle the claims to land in part. They gave the tribes back money. The federal government gave the tribes money to purchase back land. And it went a step further, though. The negotiators from the Maine delegation inserted language that would basically relegate the tribal nations to be treated like municipalities. There was also language inserted that would block any federal legislation that could benefit the tribes from having from the tribes in Maine having access to those legislations. And there have been about 150 laws passed in the last 40 years that the tribes in Maine, even though we are federally recognized tribal nations, we haven't been able to have access to or benefit from because of this language in the Settlement Act. So this has been the root cause of a lot of chaos and tension and distrust and litigation throughout the years between the state and the tribes. And my role as ambassador exists purely because we removed our representative to the legislature. And that certainly wasn't a decision we took lightly, but it didn't feel like an equitable relationship anymore. And it remains to be seen how we continue our government representation. But the role of ambassador, whether I'm in it or somebody else, it definitely feels more government to government. And that's what we're really trying to restore, is that sovereignty. So there have been many efforts to amend the 1980 Act. And to be fair to the tribal people that agreed to this, it was always kind of made clear to the tribes that this could be amended and that we could come back and revisit this if it wasn't working. And also the tribes were, kind of living in poverty and having a lot of effects of those kind of intergenerational trauma and the effects of colonization that I spoke about earlier. Those don't just kind of resolve themselves or go away. So the tribes thinking that at least they could get something in some sort of deal would be better than nothing. And it was likely that President Carter would sign this, and it was very unlikely that incoming President Reagan would. So there was also this kind of stress and pressure on the tribes to agree. There were some people back then that saw the writing on the wall and had real concerns about tribes being treated like municipalities and what that would do in the future to undermine our self-determination. So this most recent effort to amend the 1980 Act is the result of a task force called by the state government that consisted of tribal chiefs, bipartisan lawmakers, and non-voting representatives from the Attorney General's office and the governor's office and the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission. And this group came together. They studied the Settlement Act, federal Indian law, and why the tribes, have suffered under this act, and why federal Indian law makes sense for us to go by and have access to those federal acts. And I put all of this in this presentation because I think that a lot of this, toxic atmosphere between the tribes and the state, and how we haven't been able to fully act as sovereign nations, has absolutely impacted our well-being, our health outcomes, being able to access federal resources. And I think that anybody in the state that is paying attention to tribal issues or working with tribal people should definitely have some awareness of this recent effort and some of the history of it and what we're trying to do. And I should mention that this most recent effort to amend is in legislative form, LD 1626, sponsored by Assistant Majority Leader Rachel Talbot Ross, and we're working that through the legislative process. This is a photo of Jimmy Carter signing the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act with an eagle feather pen. And there's members of the Maine delegation and there's members of the tribal delegation. And as you can see, I think it felt like a hopeful moment. I think it felt like healing and something that was really going to help people. And it was seen as this historic agreement. So right now we recognize that it was certainly not the best deal, and it has had negative consequences. But I think it's important to understand that at any point in history, I think we're doing the best with what we have. So I talked a little bit about kind of the political framework that I'm working in recently, and for quite a while. But I wanted to talk about some of the social determinants of tribal health as I see them. And I know I looked at the schedule for your whole conference, and I'm really happy that you're really going to be digging into a lot of these inequities that have been laid bare by the pandemic. In my work on the Permanent Commission and the Equity Subcommittee, we've looked at how the most vulnerable and the most marginalized populations feel the effects of any large-scale horrific thing like climate change or COVID-19. They feel those effects disproportionately in a negative way. And I thought a little bit about the deep roots of inequity, and I've talked about those historical traumas and how those kind of echo through time. I wanted to tell kind of a personal story of my own healthcare experience. And I am now 37. I was 22 when I had my first daughter, and I had no health insurance besides Indian Health Services, sorry. And I was absolutely in poverty. I worked a couple part-time jobs. I had just graduated from college, and I remember being terrified to be a new mother and really was trying to navigate things the best that I could. And I only had Indian Health Services. So throughout my pregnancy, they were asking me to apply for Maine care so any referred care from IHS, if they have to refer you out, you first need to apply for Maine care and go through that process. I was unaware of that, and that turned into a very overwhelming situation for me as a young mom. I remember getting a bill for my daughter's birth, and it was like more money than I had ever made in my life. So I remember, just feeling so kind of weak and out of sorts and very confused by a lot of things. And I'll get into how IHS works in a later slide and some of the processes around here. But I just felt very cumbersome when you're already trying to heal from a birth. And after I gave birth, I remember a nurse coming in and asking me immediately if I needed Vicodin as a painkiller. And I explained to her that I was nursing my baby and didn't think that was healthy and that I didn't want the baby getting any, opioid painkiller. And she said, well, we'll just take the baby for the night and give her formula and you can sleep all night. And I remember feeling very panicked because, she was kind of in charge and she knew better than I did. But I also knew enough to know that the right thing to do to keep up with breastfeeding and lactating was to keep my baby with me and not take hard painkillers. And I remember, again, feeling very small and not seen and not heard. And I wonder if I had, more means, if I had fancy insurance, if I was older, if I wasn't a woman of color, if that experience would have been different. I had my second daughter 2 years later, and I felt a lot stronger. I was able to advocate for myself, and it went smoother. But I still felt, at times, a bit lower in status as a then 24-year-old, woman of color giving birth. So fast forward to recently, I've had, reproductive health experiences. Now I am much older. I have health insurance. I'm able to, really tell my doctor what I need. And I had a procedure that identified and treated endometriosis. And it really breaks my heart to think that a lot of women might be walking around with symptoms of this and don't have the means to access care to treat it. I feel like this is a very silent thing a lot of women go through and suffer from. And I really hope, I feel like my own experience has come a long way as a woman of color in Maine, but I really hope that we are paying attention to these symptoms and treating everybody equally and making sure that nobody is suffering. And that's a huge barrier, I think. So I think I've talked a little bit about kind of the disparities I've seen in my personal life. And I feel that this is a structural issue, that marginalized people have been invisible in our society. We're not often represented in a lot of higher places of power and professions. And I feel that if you're not seen, you're not heard. And that's part of the problem. I want to talk a little bit about food and kind of part of the Indigenous experience was the lack of access to our traditional foods. Traditionally, Wabanaki people were, we had great gardens, and we would use the Three Sisters method of gardening, where we would have corn, beans, and squash, and they would grow in a way that kind of nurtured one another. And I think that through the forced movement onto reservations, this really did a lot to our food systems and our food sovereignty. And some of the, lasting effects of colonization were based on that government food that was brought into our communities. Fry bread is a big, staple when you think about Indigenous people. And I think we've really reclaimed it and made it our own. But fry bread is essentially made of white flour, lard or oil, and things that hurt our health. So I think that's one of those tricky effects of colonization. And I'm so happy that places that tribes are looking into more food sovereignty efforts now. I think that's a huge part of our healing. I think that mental health is often overlooked when we're thinking about tribal nations. And this can be obvious things like easily identified disorders and things that can be attributed to that trauma, but it's also very insidious. And things like Indian mascots, cultural theft, and misrepresentation really do add to our view of ourselves and that harm. And all of these diseases that our people are suffering from, addiction, opioid abuse, alcoholism, diabetes, heart disease, they're all connected to that mental health. They're all connected to the stereotypes and the misrepresentations. I really don't see them as separate issues. I think it's all part of that deep wound in our soul that is manifesting in different ways. So here's an example of a pretty classic Indian mascot, stereotypical representation of our people. Now, this is the Cleveland Indian, and recently retired, thankfully. But this was supposedly based on a Penobscot person named Louis Alexis, who is from Indian Island, where I live. And we're so proud of Louis Alexis. He did play for Cleveland when they were the Cleveland Spiders. He was a really great baseball player and the first person of color, I believe, to play Major League Baseball. And after, he had a downfall there, he, was purported to have a problem with alcohol addiction. And the second his injuries kind of got the better of him, the crowd in Cleveland went from kind of passive racist, calling him chief and doing war whoops while cheering him on, to kind of harmful and actively racist. And, they would throw firecrackers at him and yell fire water and things like that on the field and boo him. And, the papers at that time were just horrible depictions of stereotypical things. So people say that these mascots should honor us and that we should feel good, that our history is being continued and that people know who we are. And when I look at this, I just can't feel honored. I can't imagine any other race being depicted in this way. And the American Psychological Association agrees And they released a finding in 2005 that these Indian mascots are harmful. So thinking about the health of Indigenous people, the health of Wabanaki people, I think you need to take this into account, and maybe not a lot of people have, that we've grown up with kind of our true experience not validated, but all of these stereotypes and misrepresentations of us being the only thing that people might know about when it comes to tribal people. And like I said, the Cleveland Indians have retired the Indian, and they will now be the Guardians. And I think that is really great progress, and I'm really happy about that. So this was on TV last night on Indigenous Peoples Day. And this is an actual picture of my TV in my bedroom that I took while we were taking a break from the Red Sox game. Yay. And so this is Disney's Pocahontas. And the reason I bring this up is that we have an epidemic in this country of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We have jurisdictional issues in our tribal communities and the laws between tribal, local, state, and federal, where these cases are often not looked into quickly. They're not given a lot of resources. And often the women that are abused or murdered are never found, and the people who have done these crimes are never arrested or brought to justice. And I want to contrast this with the recent case with Gabby Petito, who was the young white woman who went missing. Her body was later found. Her boyfriend is the prime suspect. I am so sorry that happened to her, and I think it's horrible. And I'm so happy that everyone came together, regardless of jurisdiction, regardless of anything, and immediately began to look for her and to look into where she was. It is a stark contrast between that case and every case of a missing or murdered Indigenous woman and broader women of color and people of color. So I bring up Pocahontas because the real story of Pocahontas, she was a 14-year-old girl, and she looked nothing like this. And when John Smith and the colonists came, they actually kidnapped her, took her back to Europe, and she died there from disease at a very young age. So Disney tells a story of a beautiful young Indian maiden, right? She looks like all the sexy Halloween costumes. She's in touch with nature. She's loving and caring. She takes care of John Smith. She saves him, and they fall in love and happily ever after. And it may feel good to kind of candy coat this story and make it more palatable and make Indigenous people look beautiful and great. But it really is still harmful because it perpetuates this stereotype. Having Pocahontas look like this really objectifies her. It objectifies Indian women or Indigenous women. And that's why part of the epidemic is because we are invisible, because we are objectified, because it is disposable. So this all figures into the objectification of Indigenous women, and certainly our health outcomes and our mental health and feeling like we don't matter. So equity as a public health goal or outcome. I get to do a lot of work around equity, and I'm super honored and blessed to be doing this work. We talked about the Permanent Commission on the status of racial, Indigenous, and tribal populations, also the Equity Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council. So I think about equity a lot and what that takes in our state especially. And I think conversations like this that might be hard to have, that start off kind of sad and have to find resolution together. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A to see thoughts around these things. But I think training and awareness is such a huge piece of this puzzle. And I'm really thankful for good public policy, for leaders and administrators that are looking into diversity, equity, and inclusion, and thinking about these things in a multi-layered contextual way, that it's not just, well, poor people or people of color don't have enough access to care, they don't have enough money, so that's it. It's a very one-dimensional thing. There's layers to this, and there's reasons for all of these conditions, and there's ways that we can really build up together, I think. I think a big part of this is making the invisible visible again. Hearing my voice as an Indigenous woman in Maine, hearing my personal stories and my outcomes, hearing from my children, my elders, my community. There's not a whole lot of tribal people in Maine. We're a very small population, but if we are discarded and made to feel like we don't matter, that really says something about our overall state and overall society. And kind of multiple instances have shown that when you can hold space for your most vulnerable, your most marginalized, it really benefits everyone. So I thought about healthcare workers and what I would want you to be aware of when providing care to Abenaki patients. And I talked a little bit about the IHS funding and the issues that I had with it. So the federal government has a fiduciary responsibility to provide healthcare to federally recognized tribal nations. This exists in perpetuity. It doesn't go away. It doesn't expire. And the reasons are treaties that were negotiated due to all that theft of land and resources. And it sounds, like a good arrangement, but the United States government has never lived up to those treaty obligations to the fullest extent. I mentioned in the slide earlier that I forgot to talk about. Some of the best representation I've seen about Indigenous people is a show called Reservation Dogs, and it's on FX and Hulu. And it's for Indigenous teenagers. They're kind of struggling with a tragic event, and they're trying to figure out if they should stay on their reservation and kind of make the most of it, or if they should leave and move to California and kind of leave behind their people and their community, but also the trauma and the darkness. So there's an episode of this show where they kind of poke fun at the Indian healthcare clinic, and it's crowded, it's understaffed, the staff is rude, the doctor is like the eye doctor, the dentist, and the doctor, and he's running from room to room and he can barely keep up. And I think he's doing x-rays too. And that's what it can feel like a lot. It's actually kind of accurate. I think we feel like we're really doing our best to work with what we have from the federal government, but it's not really enough. And part of the reason that we are mandated to apply for Maine Care or other services like that is the IHS trying to get out of those obligations. So my problem when I gave birth is that I had been denied Maine Care, and my letter, got lost in the shuffle. I wasn't able to provide it to the Indian Health Services, and that was complicated. I ended up ironing it all out. But it's very overwhelming for a lot of tribal people trying to figure out these systems if they don't have insurance through their employer or through private insurance. I also thought about cultural sensitivity. And our people, I think, we may have a distrust of systems or the government. And I don't think anybody could blame us. I know that our vaccination rates for COVID-19 are not where we would like them on Indian Island at my home. And I'm fully vaccinated, my whole family is, but a lot of people in our community may not trust the government and may not trust this process. So there's been a reluctance to be vaccinated. And part of our charge right now is breaking down a lot of that confusion and that fear and trying to get people to get this COVID-19 vaccination. But we found that being sensitive to those fears because of this cultural history has made a big difference. We also involve our whole family in a lot of places that in healthcare. Births, deaths, these things might have ceremonies or special things that I really feel like hospitals and institutions should be aware of and sensitive to. And I feel like having conversations with your Wabanaki or Indigenous patients, very frankly, about these things would go a really long way. And I think it's good to remember that some of our people are still in some severe poverty, or they're unhoused, or they're suffering from addictions. And the stereotypes thing plays into this too, that, there's been this narrative that Indigenous people, exist on government handouts, that we have alcohol problems, that we are unable to care for our families. And as I've explained, so much of that is due to a lot of this historical trauma. This stereotype of not being able to care for our children is because our children were taken from us without reason. So there are families that didn't get to raise their kids, and then that cycle of dysfunction certainly perpetuates and was never our fault. So being sensitive to a lot of that history and reasons for these outcomes, I think is super important. So another piece of this puzzle is the climate crisis and frontline communities. And I think, and this also really has to do with our health and our wellness. So the stewardship of land and waters is not a separate issue for Indigenous nations. It's woven into everything we do. So climate change, it's definitely, the crisis has affected everyone. And I'm so happy that the state of Maine established the Climate Council, that nationally and internationally, we are kind of starting to wake up to this and implement good policy around this. But Indigenous nations have been talking about this for a very long time. It does affect us disproportionately. Right now, and for a long time, the Passamaquoddy tribe at Pleasant Point does not have clean drinking water. I can't think of many instances in 2021 where a community does not have clean tap water to drink. And this is, partly because of that sovereignty being undermined by the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. It's partly because of failure by surrounding towns to act on a government-to-government basis with the tribe. And really, it's a human rights crisis happening right now, affecting their health. At Penobscot Nation, I live between Juniper Ridge landfill and a huge paper mill. And historically, there were 3 paper mills north of us in the Penobscot River that flowed downstream to our community, bringing dioxin, bringing mercury, bringing chemicals that poisoned our fish and our people. And the Penobscot Nation has a right to sustenance fishing. But right now, the recommendations for consumption of fish out of the Penobscot River is 4 ounces a day for someone who is over the age of 10 and not a pregnant person. So that's hardly anything you can be sustained on. Our cancer rates, our rates of other diseases are high, and we've never been able to establish a direct link between the fish in the river and the chemicals, but it's really hard to deny that link, I think. When I was younger and the paper mills were all active, there would be a thick foam on the water a lot of mornings. The water smelled bad. We had dead fish popping up all the time. And, in these 20 years or so, there have been a lot of restoration efforts. Probably one of the best collaborations between the state and our tribe is the Penobscot River restoration. We're still tied up in litigation with the state over clean water and rights to the river, but that was one good effort, and the removal of the dams. So being out on the river now, it's much cleaner. There's much more wildlife. It's healthier. The chemical levels in the fish have gotten better, but we still have a long, long way to go. And I think if you look around the state and country, you'll see that populations of people of color and tribal communities are in closer approximation to some of these industrial hazards. And there's a picture of the Penobscot River. I walk my dog every morning around 6. So I take a lot of pretty pictures of the river. And this is, our reservation territory is the river and the islands that I live on, and the islands north in the main stem of the river. So it's very intricately woven into our culture, our lifeways, our values, and our health. And that about wraps my presentation up. I did include some different ideas for further information. Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness does a tremendous amount of work. They are working actively on that Pleasant Point water crisis. They have been so amazing with all of the tribal communities throughout this pandemic, and always. They run a youth council that my daughters are part of, and I really can't say enough good things about them. The Wabanaki Alliance is a 501c3 that I am actually president of the board of directors, and we do kind of the political work and advocacy for the legislation. The Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor is a wonderful institution for educators, and it really presents the history in an unflinching and honest but beautiful way. Bumazine Land Trust is a fairly new 501c3 that's been formed, and that looks at the issues of land back in Maine and getting some of those, if there's plots that people want to donate back to the tribes, that's a tribally run place. And then Sunlight Media Collective, they do a lot of independent coverage of different tribal issues that you may not hear about in the regular news. So thank you, Kachiwaliwani, so much for having me. And I hope that I've kind of brought in your understanding about the Indigenous experience in Maine.
Thank you, Ambassador Dana. We really appreciate what you've shared with us, your personal experience, and some of the historical background that really underlies these inequities. We've got some questions that have been submitted, and so I'll read those off to you. The first few questions really have to do with this notion of making the invisible visible again. And, you know, I think you've piqued many of the audience's interest. And so what other resources might you recommend, whether they be books or documentaries or podcasts, to support continued learning by non-Indigenous people?
Oh, absolutely. So a book that I love is called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she's a Potawatomi citizen. And she comes at all of these issues from a very thoughtful but scientific lens. She's a botanist and an expert in plants. So she weaves in a lot of Indigenous values and stories and current kind of cultural things or current modern topics facing us, and with a cultural perspective and with her life experience. And I think that that's a great book. I'm also, another book is Yellow Bird, and this has to do with the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that's by Sierra Crane Murdoch. And that has to do, it kind of juxtaposes like big money and oil with some of the tragedies. A podcast I love, it's called This Land. It's by Crooked Media, I believe. Rebecca Nagel is the author and journalist. And the first season of This Land is all about the court case in Oklahoma having to do with, you know, if the United States government would honor treaties and reservation land. And that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and it actually ruled in the tribal people's favor. The second season has to do with the Indian Child Welfare Act. And it was such good reporting and a huge, well-rounded view of that issue and why it's so important to keep our children in our families and in our communities, and kind of some of the big money and big political forces that are against ICWA. I'm sure there's a lot more. I'll think of more and send you the links.
Thank you. Those are great to get started with. Another question has to do with, you know, what are some of the ways that we can act as allies, others can act as allies to Indigenous communities and really promote the need and the opportunity to bring about health equity and righting some of these structural determinants?
So the Wabanaki Alliance has a great frequently asked questions and toolkit that's all about supporting LD 1626, which is the Land Claim Settlement Act legislation. So that'll be moving through the legislative process. Also keep an eye on the work of the Permanent Commission. We'll be looking at disparities in prenatal care. We'll be looking at land access issues. And the Permanent Commission has the ability to advise the three branches of government, submit legislation, hold public hearings. So I think as the state goes forward looking at equity issues, the work of the Permanent Commission is going to be central in leading the way. And my co-chair on that is Assistant Majority Leader, Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, and she's just doing tremendous work.
Thank you. And that actually addressed another question, which was really how LD 1626 can improve some of these health disparities, and what actions might you need from the public health community to help pass that legislation? It sounds like there are some resources available, but are there other actions that the public health community might be able to assist with?
Yeah, I think testifying, writing letters to the governor, letters to your lawmakers, and some of the reason from a health perspective to support it is that when tribal communities can fully act sovereign and self-determinant, we are better able to manage all of our relationships. And that includes with Indian Health Services or health organizations in Maine. When we're not kind of under the thumb and the jurisdiction of the state of Maine, we're much better able to get resources into our communities and negotiate different policies around health and wellness for all of our people. So I would encourage you to go to Wabanaki Alliance and look into the law and exactly how it works. It's a very large bill, but kind of a simple focus, and that is equity for the tribes.
Thank you. One of the things that you said that sort of stuck with me is you referenced this deep wound in our soul that is manifesting in many ways. And one of the questions from the audience is, can you speak more about this historical trauma and how it impacts people today? For those of us who don't have that experience, what is that like? How does that carry through and across generations?
Well, I think it happens in large and small ways. When we were learning about these mass raised children from the boarding schools, it's really hard to not picture that as your child. And if I was alive a few decades earlier, or thinking of how old I am, if I was alive earlier, that could have been me or my children that were taken simply for the fact that we're Native. There was this old experiment, and I can't remember who conducted it, but it was all about mice and this orange blossom scent. And there were these mice, and they would spray them with orange blossoms while they gave them an electric shock or tortured them in some way. And later on, those mice's children and grandchildren, when they smelled orange blossom scent, they had a stress response and they remembered. And my friend Dawn Neptune Adams explains this in a project that we both did with Upstander Academy. So that's not my finding. I'm relaying it from her. But that always struck me because we might feel that pain. We might feel like we're being hunted. We might feel that stress and anxiety. And it's because of something in our DNA and our soul. And that's, scientifically proven that we're carrying that, even if we may not have experienced that. And, in my work around Indian mascots, I've seen firsthand some of the psychological harm done to our people by having our sacred objects, the eagle feathers, the war paint, the clothing being mocked and marginalized and made fun of, and being stolen to go win basketball games. And that causes a lot of harm. And then I think sometimes you're chastised or made to feel bad for expressing that harm. People tell you you're sensitive and to get over it. And then that you further internalize that oppression and feel like you are the problem. So I think we have this heavy history work we're carrying at all times, along with a modern day society that isn't always sensitive or open to our needs. And, they're used to us being so invisible and just kind of dealing with all these stuff, so that we do speak out. It's shocking sometimes.
Thank you. There is a very focused question. You referenced the drinking water contamination in the Passamaquoddy region. What actions may be needed to address the Pleasant Point contamination?
I know that Representative Rena Newell, who's the Passamaquoddy representative to the legislature, has some pending legislation to address this situation. And they're also working with the Pleasant Point tribal government and surrounding towns and the state, I believe, to address this. So I also know that Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness is involved in this effort. So if anybody, I don't know if there is a public action step, but if there is, I'm sure that they would know how to best direct you.
Thank you. And this is a great question. Are there any examples or existing partnerships between tribal communities and non-tribal partners that are working well, or good examples of successful partnerships that might help us to think about how we model other trusted partnerships to improve health for all?
That's a great question. So the recent legislative effort, we have a coalition of, I think, more than 40 organizations that support the legislation, and they've come together. We had an event yesterday for Indigenous Peoples Day, and ththose organizations really took the lead in handling the technology, the Zoom presentations, the press even, and some of, the logistics of it. So I feel like a lot of these relationships work best when they're deeply collaborative, when they're relational, not transactional, and when all parties are very interested in a good outcome. So when we have allies that come to elevate our voices, I think a real key in being successful at that is making sure that you're being honest about your intentions, and making sure that you fully understand the Indigenous perspective and want to rise that up. And I feel like if you're asking these really good questions, you're already most of the way there in your ally work. But yes, we are seeing a lot of good collaborations, and the ones that I see work the best are ones with lots of communication, and ones that have really faced a lot of that uncomfortable darkness that I kind of started this presentation with.
Thank you. I think we've gone through most of the questions that have been submitted by the audience. I guess I have one, and I'm reflecting on my own experience here in Maine. I've been fortunate to live in Maine for about 30 years now, and I really appreciate learning as much as I did from your talk, Ambassador Dana, and it certainly leaves me wanting to learn more. And you mentioned in your presentation that this notion of only when we know this history together and have that shared experience or understanding that can we kind of move forward together. And so it strikes me that this, making the invisible visible requires both people willing to tell the story and people willing to listen and understand the story. Are there any efforts, sort of any particular efforts underway, or how can we expand on this kind of sharing of the history, and how can we make that more available, and how can we as allies potentially help in that process of elevating the history of what has happened so that we can move forward together?
Excellent. So I think it starts young. There was actually a law passed in 2001 by my great aunt, Donna Loring, who at the time was the Penobscot representative to the legislature, and it required the teaching of Wabanaki studies in Maine schools. And that law has never been adequately supported, really, but recently there have been efforts to kind of look at where schools are at and if they're applying any of this curriculum and if they're living up to this law. And I think, it would make kind of all of our lives so much easier if children were getting a real honest education from very young. I think education at that level goes such a long way. In a lot of my work, I've found that some people in Maine don't even know that tribes still exist, that we're still here. So even that baseline of here's the tribal communities, here's where we are, here's what we do and what we're up to, and that we're not this like mythical died out people of the past. So I think that goes a long way. And as far as grown-ups and your organizations and things, I think that efforts like this are super important. I did, when I looked at your schedule, I thought that it's such an excellent, robust look at a lot of the different issues at play in Maine that we might not be talking about all that much. I saw that you have Chief Sabatis coming in to talk about food sovereignty and a couple other presentations. So I think just hearing from us is a great start, and really not being afraid to have those hard conversations with your friends, your neighbor, your boss, your lawmakers, and really don't be afraid to speak up for tribal rights, even if you're not tribal. We really need you to engage and to elevate our voices in any way possible.
Thank you. And as we wrap up, Ambassador Dana, is there anything else you would like to share or to remark about before we close this session?
I think I've covered quite a bit. Happy belated Indigenous Peoples Day. I think yesterday was really good for my heart. It's our third official one in Maine. And I'm really seeing Indigenous people find so much joy in being recognized and acknowledged, and they feel like they're able to ask for that next step and to think about tribal sovereignty with our friends and neighbors and allies and lawmakers. So let's just keep having these discussions and keep these open communications happening.
Great. Well, thank you for all that you were doing, and thank you for your time with us today. And we look forward to furthering the conversation, Ambassador Dana.
Thank you so much.